Okay, chapter 13 is going to look at recreational offenses. They're also sometimes referred to as quote-unquote victimless crimes, and these are drug and sex crimes. So let's start a little bit with the history and extent of drug abuse in the U.S. And this is an incredibly abbreviated version of this. If you'd like to learn more about different drugs and how they became illegal in the U.S., the History Channel has a 4-part series called Hooked: Illegal Drugs and How They Got That Way, and I highly recommend it. So, widespread use of drugs is relatively recent. Up until the early 1900s, drugs weren't illegal. They were widely available and widely used. Many people, especially early colonists, thought of alcohol as being more pure than water. Now, few Americans were seriously impacted by drugs besides alcohol, although opium was definitely a problem. Opiates come here as we welcome a large amount of Chinese immigrants in order to build the railroad system. And a lot of those laws were specifically aimed at Chinese folks and made it illegal for them in particular to use opiates, even though your typical opiate user in California during that time period was a white, middle-aged woman. So psychoactive substances, drugs are psychoactive substances. That means they have the ability to change your brain chemistry, and they gained widespread acceptance and use during the 60s and 70s. Now, when we talk about a drug offense, we're talking about any violation of laws that have to do with drugs. So either prohibiting or regulating possession, use, sale, or manufacture. And as I mentioned before, these are generally more recreational offenses. So we have a wide variety of sources that can tell us something about drug use today. Monitoring the Future is a survey of youth. They're surveyed in 8th grade, I think 10th and 12th grade about drug use. There's the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And we have a variety of some other surveys that are done. So just to give you some idea, that's a couple years old, but there's an estimated 30.5 million Americans who were 12 and older who are current users of illicit drugs. Illicit just means illegal. That's about 11.2% of the population that's 12 or older. And marijuana is the most commonly used illicit drug, and it has been for decades. The rate of use of marijuana has not changed at all in like 30 or 40 years. Now, one way we can think about what our drug problem is we can look at illicit drugs, the use of them. We can also look at how available they are. So that Monitoring the Future survey also asks kids how easy it is to obtain drugs at school. And about 2/3 of kids responded that it was pretty easy. And here we can see some data about past use within the past month, right? And we could see that marijuana is far and away the biggest drug. We can also see past month use by age group as well. And we could see the percentage of marijuana use by state. Now, the big epidemic we're really facing today is the opioid epidemic. So opioids are derivatives of the poppy plant. Opium comes from the poppy plant. It's a naturally occurring substance. Legal opioids include Oxycontin, hydrocodone, codeine, morphine, etc. But it can also be made in a lab, and that would include things like heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil. Now, opioids relax the body. They're used to treat cough and diarrhea and pain, but they also create a sense of euphoria. They're also incredibly addictive, and overdose and death are common. Now, if you find somebody who has just overdosed, you can administer naloxone. Usually it's as a nasal spray, and that can stop the overdose. We also have several drugs we use to treat opioid addiction. They're used as sort of a maintenance drug. Methadone, buprenorphine is Suboxone, and naltrexone. These are also, though, pretty addictive. Suboxone hasn't been around as long for us to have as much information on it, but many people report that methadone is harder to kick than heroin. Now, the president had a commission on combating drug addiction, and the opioid crisis, and he wanted the experts to develop some recommendations and called for a national media campaign. Now, the cost of this crisis in the U.S. is $500 billion a year. So they have recommended alternatives to opioids. And in fact, Tylenol is generally just as good as using a prescriptive opioid for most things. They also called for developing drugs to reverse overdose, which we do have, and medications to assist in treating opioid addiction. We also started to see people deal with this problem by bringing lawsuits against drug manufacturers and distributors. And if you Google the Sackler family, they own Purdue, not Purdue the chicken. It's a pharmaceutical company, and they are the inventors of OxyContin, and they are absolutely responsible for the OxyContin problem, which then leads to the heroin problem we have today. And here we can see deaths from different opioid use and then just opioids in general. Now, Americans spend about $103 billion per year purchasing illegal drugs. It's a huge part of the economy. That doesn't include any social costs. So things like HIV and AIDS that can be traced to IV drug use. And here again, we could see how much is spent on illegal drugs by drug. Here we can also see a little bit about some of those other costs. So labor costs, so that's like missed days of work or people being unproductive at work because they're under the influence, hospitalization, treatment costs, etc. Now, the way we deal with drugs being illegal today is we follow the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. That basically divides drugs into 5 categories or schedules, okay? And Schedule 1 is supposed to be the most dangerous of drugs. You can see up here, right? It says a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and it lacks any safe amount to use, okay? Now look at what drugs are in that list. Heroin, opioids, hallucinogens, GHB, and marijuana. Marijuana doesn't meet that definition, okay? And DEA administrative judges have been recommending for decades that marijuana should be reclassified. So the way we make a drug illegal now is we just make it a Schedule 1 substance. So you might have noticed cocaine is a Schedule 2 substance. Your doctor can prescribe cocaine. Okay, drug trafficking, as opposed to drug offenses, is the manufacture, distributing, dispensing, importing, and exporting a controlled or counterfeit substance. So generally it's what we think of when we think of drug sales. Now, some drugs are particularly easy to smuggle. Things like cocaine, heroin, and LSD. LSD especially because you need such a teeny tiny amount to get high. Now, most cocaine entering the U.S. comes from South America. There's direct, you're going to see in the next figure what some of these shipping routes are. And the DEA is able to figure out where heroin came from because they have tested heroin from different locations to see its components. And here you can see these drug shipping routes. There's one thing that your book mentioned that I actually just heard differently in some documentary I just watched. I think your book mentions that most heroin's coming from Afghanistan, but most heroin makes its way into the U.S. from Mexico. Here we see methamphetamine. Now, how do drugs make it into the illegal market? Well, they could be prescribed drugs, legal drugs, which have been diverted from pharmacies. So that could be through doctor shopping, where you're going to doctors that you know write prescriptions easily, illegal prescribing and dispensing. And the DEA does track this as well. And they do investigate pharmacies that seem to have, or doctors that seem to have way too many opioid prescriptions. Now, synthetic drugs are new substances so that when a substance becomes illegal, they basically alter it a little bit, alter the chemical makeup, and come up with a new drug. One way that the government has been dealing with that in recent years is to make the structure of a particular drug illegal. That way, when someone makes something similar, it's automatically illegal. Now we have drug-defined crimes. Those are exactly what we think of: possession, use, distribution of drugs. And drug-related crimes, those are crimes that contribute to the offense, okay? Things that are done in order to maybe further your drug use. Now, drug-related crime can occur a couple ways. Some is psychopharmacological, okay? That's the first bullet point. Psychopharmacological means it's caused by the actual drug. Very few drugs induce violent behavior. PCP absolutely induces violent behavior. Now, sometimes drugs are related to crime because what someone is doing in order to support their drug habit. They're stealing, robbing people. And then the drug market itself is often violent. There's also considerable evidence of this strong relationship between drug use and crime. Drug users have greater involvement in crime. People with criminal records are more likely to report being drug users. And as drug use increases, the number of crimes increase. Now here we're going to see some of the ways the federal government has tried to deal with this. So as I mentioned, up until 1906, people would walk around and they would sell what they call patent medicines. So some guy comes into your town and he's got some medicine that you can take that's going to make you feel better. Yeah, it's going to make you feel better because it has opiates in it. But you don't know that's in there. So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act requires us to label patent medicines. Right? So now if you look at a medicine bottle, it has all the ingredients in it. In 1914, we start regulating narcotics, which includes cocaine and coca. Now, there's a misnomer here because narcotics actually refers to opiates, but narcotics is sometimes incorrectly used to refer to drugs. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act is enacted. This doesn't actually make marijuana illegal. It makes it so that you have to have a stamp in order to show that you paid the tax to sell the marijuana, okay? Kind of like how the bottom of a package of cigarettes has a stamp on it that shows that taxes were paid on them. Except you can't get the stamp without the marijuana. And if you have the marijuana, you've already possessed it illegally in order to get the stamp. So it effectively outlawed it, but it didn't actually outlaw it. We talked about the 1970 Comprehensive Drug Abuse Act. That's where the Controlled Substance Act is. We've got a couple other more recent pieces of legislation to look at. In 1996, they passed a law trying to deal with methamphetamines. This is why now if you go to the store and you want to buy Sudafed, it's behind a counter and you have to show your ID. It allows people to seize ingredients used to make meth and to regulate those ingredients. Now, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act provides money to treat drug addiction, and it provides money for drug courts. Now, the other big thing it does is it expands the death penalty to include drug trafficking. No one has been sentenced to death for drug trafficking, though. And I don't think it would hold up if it were brought to the Supreme Court. It also mandated life without parole for anyone with 3 drug convictions. And then more recently in 2016, the federal government provided $1 billion in grants to states to assist in drug treatment, prevention, and monitoring prescription drugs. So we deal with drugs in a couple ways. We try to do what's called interdiction, stop the drugs from coming into the U.S. We use different laws. We also use what's called asset forfeiture. We talked about this in the chapter that deals with corporate crime and white-collar crime and organized crime. Asset forfeiture means if you're involved in a drug offense, once arrested for that offense, the government can come in and seize anything you have that's either that you bought with drug proceeds, the drugs. If you're making drugs in your house, they can come take your house. And we've also used a lot of drug education, although most drug education is terrible. Now, we've also seen a big change recently with states decriminalizing and then states legalizing marijuana. And there's been some arguments as to whether or not we should decriminalize and legalize other drugs. So the war on drugs has been very, very costly, and it's done a great amount of damage. So decriminalization is the first thing that happened in Massachusetts. It happened back in, I think, 2004. Okay, what that does is it makes something an infraction. No longer becomes a criminal offense. So up until we recently legalized marijuana in Massachusetts, if you had possession of under an ounce, it was a $100 fine. Okay, wasn't a criminal thing, just a $100 fine. It's a ticket. Today in Massachusetts, we have legalization, right? As long as you are not a minor. Both of these approaches are based on the idea that drug abuse will never be eliminated. And in particular with marijuana, it's based in the fact that marijuana is actually not that dangerous. It's actually significantly less dangerous for you than alcohol. All right, moving on to recreational sex offenses. This is where we're talking about prostitution, which more importantly is kind of referred to as sex work today. And it's engaging in sexual activity for money or the equivalent of money. Now, both John's clients and sex workers, prostitutes, can be charged for this. It's generally a misdemeanor, and it's illegal everywhere except for some parts in Nevada where it's actually regulated. Now, research tells us that this underground commercial sex economy has changed over time. So in the past, prostitutes walked up and down a street in Boston, not too far actually from school, where the theater district is now, kind of now where Cafe Nero is down by, I can't think of what theater that is, but that was all part of the combat zone. Drugs and prostitution is what was down there when I was a kid. So there's new ways to recruit and advertise today, though, right? Today it's much more internet-based. So streetwalkers are considered the lowest class of prostitute. They solicit in public, they have the lowest prices, and face the greatest risks. Bar and hotel prostitutes have standing relationships with those hotel professionals and have a much lower risk of both harm and arrest. Club girls are girls that work in strip clubs and can do, quote, double duty as onstage performers. And then we have anybody who's soliciting through online ads. Okay, that could be Backpage. It could be an escort website, Craigslist. The agency generally screens customers for sex workers. They charge high prices, though. And then we have places where it is legal. Okay, and these are brothel or house prostitutes. As I mentioned, this is only in a few counties in Nevada, but in other countries, this is legalized across the nation. Now, we also see a really negative side of this, a side that we don't consider to be recreational. And this is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. This is the growing role of children in the sex trade. Okay. Now, in some states, children can still be charged as a prostitute, but we're moving away from that. Okay. And federally, that anybody under the age of 18 who is the quote prostitute is actually considered a victim of human trafficking. Okay. So that includes trafficking children for sex as well as child pornography. The average age of entry into the sex industry in the U.S. is 14 to 16 years old. And we want to remember these are not criminal offenders. These are victims. And here we have a series of pieces of legislation that attempt to deal with the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Now, once involved in the sex trade, it can obviously be very difficult to leave. It's generally a long process and requires a lot of support. Social services just don't really meet the need of people wanting to leave. Now, people do leave because their family and friends or dangers associated with the work. Now, some feminists argue that sex work exploits women and it demeans them and subjects them to violence and disease. Others say that it should be up to an individual woman if she wants to trade sex for money, and that is often seen as legitimate. Now, again, we've got legalization versus decriminalization. So legalization would be what we see in some counties in Nevada, women above a specified age, very few restrictions, although those usually include things like you need to be licensed, being screened for sexually transmitted diseases, whereas decriminalization would reduce penalties associated with that.